Returning to our top story today, Australian Special Forces have been accused of up to 39 murders of prisoners and civilians in Afghanistan, and 19 current or former soldiers will face criminal investigation. Nick McKenzie is an investigative journalist at The Age whose reporting was key in exposing the crimes, and he joins me now. Good evening. Can you tell us, what was the most damning evidence that was unearthed in this weighty investigation?
Well, over 4 years, the senior judge leading the investigation interviewed more than 400 serving and former commandos and SAS, the soldiers who'd served in Afghanistan and officers, and critically, people on oath testified that they'd either witnessed war crimes or in some cases have been involved in war crimes, so confessed. We're talking about the summary execution or the alleged summary execution of prisoners, sometimes men with their hands bound, and civilians. So the worst sort of war crimes one could imagine. The evidence is described by the judge as credible, but that sort of underplays its significance. The credible evidence has been referred to the federal police, but only because the judge believes there is some prospect of, with further investigation, a successful criminal prosecution. So we're talking about very significant evidence and potentially some very significant consequences for those accused in the coming months and years.
So, Nick, how did this all start unravelling?
Well, after the conflict, obviously it's been an extremely long war. Australia's longest war became the unwinnable war and then the forgotten war. Our troops returned, our special forces returned largely home in 2013-14. And after then, it was rumours that began to circulate within the regiment, within the commandos. Some of these rumours reached more senior officers. Some of these rumours reached journalists. And ultimately, as we reported on not just rumours, but as we found whistleblowers who told us about significant evidence that they believed existed. Sometimes these people had witnessed alleged war crimes. That began to come into play. The generals, the military brass, commissioned a couple of reviews. They too, in 2015-16, found significant allegations or credible allegations of very serious war crimes. And that's what prompted the judicial investigation, the Commission of Inquiry by Justice Brereton, which has been tabled or released today, that 4-year exhaustive probe. There's a really big difference with what's happened in Australia to what's happened in the United States, the United Kingdom, and I dare say New Zealand, in that our government, our Defence Force has not turned away. It's looked very closely at these allegations with forensic exhaustive rigour, and the result is an investigation which has found shocking things, but nevertheless has led to this sort of really, I think, unique accountability that's not been seen amongst other Western nations in respect of how their troops conduct themselves on deployment in Afghanistan. Given
the extent of the allegations, did senior officers know what was going on? Where does the buck stop? Did politicians know about this kind of behaviour?
Well, His Honour Justice Brereton looked at that very question and said there was no evidence that any officer, junior, middle ranking or senior, engaged in or directed a war crime. But nevertheless, he said there was a collective responsibility up the chain of command that I guess was weakened as it goes further up the chain of command and as the commanders are further away from the on-the-ground action. But that responsibility involves looking after or contributing to a culture where war crimes don't occur, ensuring that there's enough oversight, enough rigour in terms of leadership, moral leadership, where these things don't occur. And that clearly failed. So there is culpability up the chain of command, not for direct involvement, but for failing to put into place a system, a culture, a leadership, esprit de corps where these things didn't happen. But one of the things that the Justice has picked or raised is this warrior culture that some senior officers privileged or prioritised above. A warrior culture is pretty famous in special forces around the world. That's fine as long as it's partnered with a moral culture. So, they can be great warriors, but they're moral warriors. The moral side of things was left out, and in the end, we had small patrols, teams of 4 to 5 men, a small number of men who went rogue, who thought it was a great sport to allegedly execute weak, defenceless Afghans. So, what will happen next? The officers will be demoted. Some will be demoted. Some will lose medals and citations, and there'll be administrative processes surrounding those who are seen to have contributed to that command failure, as the soldiers themselves, who are the alleged trigger pullers, may in due course face our criminal justice system.
When you say that, when you talk about the criminal justice system and potentially this police investigation, I mean, how realistic is it that police will be able to investigate to the point they can charge people?
Well, we already know through court hearings in Australia that the Australian Federal Police has collected eyewitness statements implicating Australia's most famous soldier, Ben Robert Smith, VC, in respect of alleged war crimes. There's a brief of evidence with the Director of Public Prosecutions. He denies all wrongdoing, but that process is a direct result of the Inspector General's inquiry. It commenced 2 years ago, midway to that inquiry. And I think in answer to your question, that tells us that the police have already gone and got statements from eyewitnesses. Yes, they've been denied the allegations, but nevertheless there's been a lengthy process underway. That process will be repeated in respect of the 19 or so other men who will be referred to police in coming days and weeks. Police will see about taking statements, looking at evidence such as photos taken in the combat zone, reporting over radios that's captured in the combat zone, villagers who might be witnesses, support staff, medics, interpreters who may witness things. These are all potential sources of evidence, and it will be the police's job to find those and compile them into briefs for prosecution.
Nick, just briefly before you go, obviously this is a weighty report. New Zealand was in Afghanistan during this time. Is there any mention of our New Zealand forces there?
New Zealand was outside the scope of the jurisdiction of this report, as were other nations. But I would say one would be, I think, foolish to think that there wasn't some sort of a culture in the various special forces who often had secondees working with other nations. So an Australian would work with the US Special Forces or the NZ Special Forces. We know the US Special Forces have faced grave allegations. People have been charged for shocking alleged war crimes. There's been significant allegations made in Britain and also in New Zealand. So I think what this tells us is if there is an exhaustive judicial type process to lift under the rocks, there will be some bad things hiding there. How many, in the case of New Zealand, one can't say. But unless there's that exhaustive judicial process, you could also never know.
Nick, really appreciate your time this evening. That's Nick McKenzie, who's an investigative journalist at The Age, and his reporting in part was key in exposing those alleged crimes.